When Elvis Presley passed away in 1977, the world stood still. But for Ozzy Osbourne, it was more than just the loss of a pop culture icon. It was the loss of a personal hero who had shaped his world. In a raw, unfiltered interview with Howard Stern in 1999, Ozzy would reveal just how deeply the death of Elvis affected him, shattering the image of the tough rock star we all know. This was the moment a rock legend showed his vulnerability, and the impact rippled far beyond the music world. This isn't just about the death of Elvis. It's about the man who helped shape rock and roll, and the deep emotional connection he had with his fans, especially Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy's reaction to the news was not only emotional but deeply personal. As he sat with Howard Stern in 1999, the pain of Elvis's death resurfaced, revealing a side of Ozzy Osbourne few had ever seen before. Elvis Presley was a legend, but his influence wasn't just limited to his music. It was in the way he shaped an entire generation. For Ozzy, Presley wasn't just an idol but a guide, someone who showed him how to live boldly in the world of rock. When Elvis died, Ozzy not only lost a hero, he lost a part of himself. This story is about how that loss affected him, how it made him reflect on his own legacy, and how, despite all the chaos, Elvis's passing left an indelible mark on his soul. Through this true audio story, we delve into the emotional turmoil Ozzy went through, showing how even the most rebellious rock stars are shaped by grief. This is a raw, real reflection on loss, hero worship, and the profound impact of those we admire most. Before Ozzy Osbourne became the infamous frontman of Black Sabbath, he was just a boy growing up in the working-class streets of Birmingham, England. His family was poor, and life was a constant struggle. Ozzy found solace in the only place he could: music. For a boy who didn't quite fit in, music was his escape, his refuge. But it wasn't just any music. It was Elvis Presley who first captured his heart. From the moment he heard Elvis's voice, Ozzy was hooked. The raw power, the untamed energy of Elvis's sound stirred something deep within him. To Ozzy, Elvis wasn't just another pop star. He was a force, a larger-than-life presence that had the ability to transport anyone who listened into a world of freedom, rebellion, and expression. It wasn't long before Ozzy, like countless other young fans, saw Elvis as something more than an idol. He saw him as a guide, someone who could show him how to rise above the hardship of his environment. Elvis Presley didn't just change rock and roll, he transformed the entire music landscape. His infectious rhythms, groundbreaking voice, and electrifying performances took the world by storm. He didn't just sing songs, he embodied a revolution. In a time when music was often staid and restrained, Elvis burst forth with a freedom that defied societal norms, becoming the voice of an entire generation. His fame didn't stop at the United States borders. Elvis's influence was felt worldwide, and it spread across oceans, continents, and cultures. For Ozzy, Elvis wasn't just an entertainer, he was a beacon of possibility. Presley's defiance of societal standards, his unapologetic personality, and his fearless pursuit of artistic expression resonated deeply with Ozzy, who, as a teenager, was struggling with the same feeling of being an outsider. For a young Ozzy, listening to Elvis was more than just about enjoying music. It was about learning what it meant to break free, to embrace who you were, no matter how the world viewed you. He idolized Elvis not just for his hits, but for the man he was, a symbol of rebellion, courage, and confidence in the face of adversity. This connection to Elvis's music wasn't just about admiration, it became a roadmap for Ozzy's own future. Ozzy was no casual listener. He didn't just admire Elvis. He was in awe of him. As a teenager, Ozzy studied Presley's every move, his voice, his style, his stage presence. To Ozzy, Elvis was the epitome of what it meant to be a rock star. He wasn't just performing on stage, he was living his truth. This wasn't lost on Ozzy, who dreamed of one day following in Elvis's footsteps and creating his own legacy. In fact, Ozzy would go on to describe Elvis as the true king of rock, a phrase that encapsulated the idolization Ozzy felt for the man who had changed music forever. As Ozzy grew older, this admiration deepened. He began to adopt Elvis's fearlessness, his passion for music, and his rebellious streak. Elvis became Ozzy's guiding light, his model for what it meant to succeed not just in the music world, but in life. And as Ozzy's own career began to take off, he could always trace his motivations back to Elvis. For Ozzy, Presley wasn't just an inspiration, he was a kind of hero, one whose shadow Ozzy would follow, willingly, for much of his life. For Ozzy, Elvis was more than just a star. He was the father figure he never had. The mentor who guided him through the turbulence of youth, growing up in a family that struggled financially. Ozzy had often felt lost, but in Elvis's music, he found hope. His songs spoke to Ozzy's own pain and longing, offering him a sense of solace that nothing else could. It was as if Elvis's music held the answers to all of Ozzy's questions about life, purpose, and freedom. When Ozzy was at his lowest, he would listen to Elvis, and for a few minutes, it was as if the world faded away. Elvis became a source of emotional strength, a way for Ozzy to keep going in the face of bullying, hardship, and self-doubt. He wasn't just a fan, he was a devotee, a person who clung to the belief that, like Elvis, he too could escape his circumstances and make something of himself. In every Elvis song, Ozzy found a piece of his own story. Years later, in 1999, Ozzy sat down with Howard Stern to discuss the loss of his idol, the death of Elvis Presley. At this point, Ozzy was already a legend in his own right, known worldwide for his wild antics and hard rock persona. Yet, when he spoke of Elvis, something shifted in his demeanor. The tough, larger-than-life persona that had become synonymous with Ozzy Osbourne began to fade, replaced by the emotional vulnerability of a man who had just lost a personal hero. Little did anyone know that this interview would open the door to an emotional journey that few had ever expected from the rock icon. Explore the emotional buildup to Ozzy's grief, including his internal conflict and the personal toll that Elvis's death took on him. On August 16, 1977, the unthinkable happened. The king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, passed away at the age of 42 from a heart attack. It wasn't just the end of an era for rock and roll. Elvis was a global icon, someone who had transcended music to become a cultural symbol. The news hit the world like a hammer, with fans across the globe reeling from the loss of a legend. But for Ozzy Osbourne, it was more than just another celebrity death. It was the death of a personal hero, a man who had shaped the very fabric of Ozzy's life and career. The media was flooded with tributes. Fans gathered at Graceland to mourn, and musicians paid their respects. Yet, amid the overwhelming grief, Ozzy's reaction stood out, not just because of his fame, but because of the raw, unfiltered emotions he revealed about the depth of his loss. When Ozzy first heard the news, his immediate response was one of disbelief. In the 1999 interview with Howard Stern, he vividly recalled that moment. "I couldn't believe it. He was supposed to live forever. It's like the world just stopped." His voice cracked during this admission, and the audience could hear the strain as Ozzy fought back tears. To Ozzy, Elvis wasn't just a pop star. He was the embodiment of everything Ozzy had aspired to be. He had always believed that Elvis was invincible, a force of nature whose music would continue to fill the air forever. The idea that he was gone, that his hero had been taken so suddenly, shook Ozzy to his core. In that moment, the rock star facade crumbled, and the man who had been so used to presenting himself as tough and indestructible was suddenly exposed. The grief, the sense of loss, the vulnerability, it was all laid bare for the world to see. Ozzy was no longer the rebellious icon. He was a man mourning the death of someone who had meant everything to him. As Ozzy continued to speak with Howard Stern, the weight of his loss became even more apparent. He began reflecting on his childhood, on the first time he saw Elvis on TV, performing with the kind of swagger and confidence that seemed to defy everything. He was the first one to make me think, I want to be like that, Ozzy said. It wasn't just the music, it was Elvis's entire being, his presence, his boldness. Ozzy had spent his youth dreaming of following in those footsteps. The idea of being able to perform like Elvis, to feel the power of his music coursing through him, was what drove him to start his own journey into rock and roll. Now, with Elvis gone, that dream felt hollow, as if a part of Ozzy's very identity had been ripped away. For Ozzy, the loss wasn't just about the death of an artist. It was the death of a version of himself that he had always admired, a version of himself that felt connected to something greater than fame and fortune, a connection to the soul of rock and roll itself. As the years went on, Ozzy found himself grappling with the deeper emotional implications of Elvis's death. He wasn't just mourning a musician, he was facing his own mortality. The idea that anyone, even someone as legendary as Elvis, could be taken so suddenly, so unexpectedly, forced Ozzy to confront the fragility of life. For someone who had built a career on defying the odds, on pushing boundaries, on rejecting society's norms, the loss of Elvis made Ozzy realize that even the strongest can fall. It wasn't just the passing of an idol, it was a reminder that the end comes for everyone. Ozzy, who had long lived in the chaotic, dangerous world of rock and roll, found himself pondering his own legacy, his own place in the universe. The more he reflected, the more Ozzy struggled with his own fears of being forgotten. What did it mean to live in the shadow of someone like Elvis? Could he ever measure up? Was there a part of him that was still trying to live through Elvis's influence rather than finding his own path? These questions swirled in Ozzy's mind, creating a deep internal conflict that would continue to haunt him for years to come. As Ozzy's grief continued to fester, his internal struggles grew. In the interview with Howard Stern, the moment would come when Ozzy would reveal the true depth of his pain. This wasn't just a man remembering his hero, it was a man confronting his own vulnerability, his own fear of mortality. And as he opened up, the emotional dam that had been holding back his grief finally broke. For Ozzy, this was no longer just about Elvis's death. It was about understanding his own journey, his own mortality, and what it meant to move forward when a guiding light had been extinguished. Highlight the emotional climax, where Ozzy fully opens up about the impact of Elvis's death on his life and identity. The raw, emotional weight that Ozzy had been carrying finally erupted in the 1999 interview with Howard Stern. It was here, in front of millions of listeners, that Ozzy allowed himself to be vulnerable. As he spoke of Elvis's death, Ozzy's voice faltered. The pain was so palpable, so raw, that even Stern, who was used to interviewing the most guarded and infamous personalities, paused to take it in. This was a side of Ozzy Osbourne that no one had ever witnessed before, a rock star stripped of his bravado, exposing the deepest part of his grief. I realized, I can't live forever, Ozzy confessed, his voice trembling as he relived the pain of that moment, and that really scared me. It was a simple statement, yet it carried so much weight. It wasn't just the loss of a hero, it was the realization that life was fleeting, that even the most immortal of icons could be taken away without warning. Ozzy's fear of his own mortality, something he had never openly acknowledged before, was now out in the open, and it shook him to his core. In that moment, Ozzy was no longer just the loud, chaotic frontman of Black Sabbath. He was a man, a human being, grappling with a deep, unshakable sorrow. The tough persona he had crafted over years of public life began to dissolve, and in its place stood someone who was openly grieving, someone who was struggling to make sense of a world that could be so cruel, so unforgiving. This emotional breakdown marked a pivotal turning point for Ozzy. It was here that he realized that the death of Elvis had forced him to confront something he had avoided for most of his life: his own vulnerability. For years, Ozzy had hidden behind his rebellious, devil-may-care attitude, the persona of the wild rock star who didn't care about anything. But Elvis's death brought him face to face with his own fears: fear of loss, fear of mortality, fear of never being able to live up to the legacy of the people he idolized. For the first time in his life, Ozzy was forced to reckon with the fact that even he was not invincible, that the world didn't revolve around him, and that his own journey was finite. And in this raw admission, Ozzy experienced a deep, transformative shift. No longer was he content to simply follow in Elvis's footsteps. The death of his idol had opened his eyes to a deeper truth, that his own path was his to carve. He didn't need to live in the shadow of Elvis anymore. He could create his own legacy, on his own terms. But while this realization marked a turning point, it didn't immediately provide clarity. Ozzy's struggle with identity and legacy only deepened in the aftermath of Elvis's death. While he understood that he had to embrace his own imperfections and find his own way, the tension within him didn't disappear overnight. Ozzy's career and persona were so closely tied to the legacy of rock music that he often felt like he was living in a never-ending competition with the greats, particularly Elvis. He wasn't just trying to find his own voice, he was constantly battling the fear that he would never be able to fill the void left by Presley. In the interview, Ozzy spoke about the inner turmoil that plagued him as he watched his own career evolve. "I didn't know if I could do it without him," he admitted, referencing how Elvis's death made him question his place in the world. It was a sentiment that most people would never associate with the brash, unapologetic Ozzy Osbourne. To them, Ozzy was the wild man who could handle anything, who could stare down death and laugh. But in this moment, Ozzy was exposing something raw: his fear of living up to the legends that had come before him. This struggle would become a central theme in Ozzy's life for many years to come. The fear that he would never be able to live up to Elvis's legacy haunted him, pushing him to keep creating, to keep performing, to keep searching for meaning in a world that suddenly seemed far more fragile than he had ever realized. As Ozzy continued to reflect on Elvis's death and the impact it had on his life, the journey toward understanding himself began. The emotional floodgates had opened, and while it was painful, it also paved the way for a new understanding of who Ozzy was. He had spent so much time living in the shadow of others, idolizing figures like Elvis, that he had never fully embraced his own unique journey. But as his reflection continued, Ozzy began to accept the reality that, while Elvis would always be a part of his life and music, he was now responsible for defining his own legacy. Reflect on how Elvis's death shaped Ozzy's career and personal growth, and examine the broader impact on rock music. In the years that followed Elvis's death, Ozzy began to understand just how profound an effect the king of rock had on his life. At first, the loss was crippling. For a man like Ozzy, who had always looked up to Elvis as a symbol of strength and rebellion, the idea that even legends are mortal was a bitter pill to swallow. But as time passed, Ozzy began to process the loss in a new light. In interviews over the years, Ozzy has reflected on the impact of Elvis's death, and he's often spoken about how it forced him to confront his own vulnerabilities. He realized that while Elvis's death represented the end of an era, it also signified the beginning of his own era. He began to acknowledge that it was time to stop living in the shadow of those who had come before him, especially Elvis, and instead focus on forging his own path. As Ozzy looked back on his own career, he came to appreciate that his journey was not just about following in the footsteps of his idols. It was about carving out a legacy that would inspire future generations of musicians. While Elvis had shown him the power of music to change lives, Ozzy now understood that it was his turn to do the same. In many ways, Ozzy's personal transformation in the wake of Elvis's death mirrored the evolution of his own career. He had gone from being a young boy obsessed with mimicking his idol to a man who recognized the importance of creating something uniquely his own. Elvis's death wasn't just a personal loss for Ozzy. It marked the end of an era for rock and roll. The 1970s had been a decade of transition for rock music. Many of the old guard, including Elvis, were beginning to fade, making way for the next wave of musical pioneers. For Ozzy, Elvis's death signified the loss of a foundational figure in rock and roll. It felt as though something irreplaceable had been taken from the world of music. But Ozzy would soon realize that the cultural void left by Elvis wasn't something that could be filled by just one person. It was up to the next generation of rock stars to step up and carry the torch. As the years passed, Ozzy did just that. His music with Black Sabbath, and later as a solo artist, reshaped the face of rock, giving rise to an entirely new genre, heavy metal. But through it all, Ozzy carried the lessons he learned from Elvis: the rebelliousness, the boldness, the refusal to be constrained by society's expectations. These qualities, which he had admired in Elvis, were now deeply ingrained in Ozzy's own identity. In this way, Elvis's death became the catalyst for a new era in rock music. While Elvis had been a trailblazer in his time, it was now up to the likes of Ozzy to redefine what it meant to be a rock star in the 1980s and beyond. And while no one would ever truly replace Elvis Presley, Ozzy helped ensure that his influence lived on in a new generation of music. Though Elvis's death was a tragedy, it had an unexpected consequence. It helped propel Ozzy Osbourne to new heights. Without the looming presence of his hero, Ozzy was forced to create his own path. He began to embrace his individuality, and in doing so he became one of the most influential figures in the history of rock music. Ozzy's journey was not without its own trials, but through the turmoil and the years of self-doubt, he emerged as a rock icon in his own right. By embracing his flaws, his vulnerability, and his personal experiences, Ozzy carved out a space in rock history that was uniquely his. And in doing so, he became a beacon for those who felt like outsiders, just as he had once felt when he was a young boy in Birmingham, listening to Elvis on the radio. As Ozzy's career continued to unfold, his respect for Elvis never waned. He continued to honor his memory through his music and interviews, always speaking of Presley with reverence and admiration. But over time, it became clear that while Elvis's influence was undeniable, Ozzy had created something entirely his own, and that was the true legacy of Elvis's death. It wasn't just about the loss of an icon, but the birth of new icons who would continue to push the boundaries of music. Ozzy's relationship with Elvis had transformed over the years. What had started as idolization and hero worship had evolved into a deep respect for the man and his music. But perhaps more importantly, Elvis had become the spark that ignited Ozzy's own drive to leave his mark on the world of music, not as a mere copy of his idol, but as a legend in his own right. Summarize the emotional journey, offer reflection, and encourage audience engagement. The death of Elvis Presley in 1977 wasn't just the end of an era. It was a pivotal moment for those who were shaped by him, including Ozzy Osbourne. This emotional journey revealed a side of Ozzy that few had ever seen, reminding us all that even rock legends are vulnerable to loss and grief. Ozzy's grief over Elvis's passing was raw and unfiltered, exposing the human side of a man who had spent much of his career cultivating a tough, rebellious image. In this deeply emotional moment, we saw the true impact of a hero on someone's life, not just as an artist, but as a guiding force that shaped their identity. For Ozzy, Elvis wasn't just a legend whose death left a cultural void. He was a personal symbol of freedom, rebellion, and hope. His passing forced Ozzy to confront his own mortality, something the rock star had avoided for years. It wasn't just about losing an icon. It was about Ozzy coming to terms with the fact that everyone, even those we hold on pedestals, will eventually leave. And in that realization, Ozzy found the strength to carve out his own legacy, stepping into his own identity as a rock icon, not just as someone who had lived in the shadow of a legend. Elvis's death wasn't just a personal loss for Ozzy. It was a reminder that the people we idolize can shape our lives in ways we never expected. And when they're gone, it's up to us to find our own way forward. Ozzy's journey shows us that while it's easy to become lost in the legacy of those who came before us, the true power lies in embracing our individuality, flaws and all. Elvis's passing may have shaken Ozzy to his core, but it also ignited a fire within him, a fire that led him to create a new legacy that would inspire future generations of musicians. Ozzy's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of loss. When we lose someone we admire, we're not just mourning their absence. We're also forced to look inward and discover what they truly meant to us and what we can do with the space they leave behind. How did the death of Elvis Presley affect you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're inspired by this emotional journey, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories of music legends and their legacies. We want to hear how these stories resonate with you, and we invite you to join us as we continue exploring the untold legacies of rock stars, their journeys, and the profound impact they've had on the world.